Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to explore something pretty amazing, how some of ancient China's most important texts were completely transformed, not by being rewritten, but just by how people decided to read them.
Take a look at this. Yeah, you're seeing that right. A plague of insects. That's it. That is an entire, complete entry from one of the most important historical texts in Chinese history, the Spring and Autumn Annals. It covers over 200 years, but a lot of it is, well, it's just like this. Super short, super to the point.
So, this brings up a huge question, right? How in the world does a book that's so sparse, so skeletal, become a cornerstone of an entire civilization? How does something like this get studied by scholars for thousands of years? Okay, let's really dive into this. Well, the answer, and this is what's so fascinating, isn't really about what the text says at all. It's about how people learn to read it. It's a story about finding incredible meaning in what isn't said. Okay, so here's the first big step. Tradition eventually linked this text to the ultimate sage, Confucius. And once people believed he was the final editor, everything changed. Suddenly, that super brief style couldn't just be, early primitive record keeping. No way. If the great sage himself did it, it had to be on purpose. It had to be a kind of strategic silence, packed with hidden moral judgments. And this gave birth to this revolutionary new idea, a principle you could translate as subtle words, great meaning. The idea was that a reader's real job wasn't just to get the facts. No, it was to go on a hunt, to uncover the huge messages that Confucius had supposedly hidden in the gaps, in the things he left out, even in tiny, subtle changes in wording. The most important stuff was the stuff that wasn't even there. So you can imagine, once everyone believes there's a hidden code, what happens next? Well, everybody wants a key. This created a huge demand for guidebooks, commentaries that could unlock all those secrets. And of course, that led to different schools of thought, each with its own way of cracking the code. Now, what's really cool here is how you can see this clear split in how they approached it. First, you've got the Zoo commentary. It tried to fill in the historical blanks, right? To add the flesh, the stories, the speeches, the context to that bare-bones logbook. But then you have the other two, the Gongyang and the Guoyang commentaries. They went in a completely different direction. They weren't trying to explain history. They were trying to uncover a hidden philosophical system, a whole set of moral laws from those subtle words. And this way of thinking, this whole reading between the lines approach, was so powerful it didn't stay confined to the annals. It started to get applied to other ancient classics, and sometimes it transformed their meaning so completely they became almost unrecognizable. So let's take this poem from the classic of poetry. On the surface, it's a really beautiful, simple love song. You've got a young guy who sees this graceful woman. He's totally captivated, and he's tossing and turning all night, just dreaming of winning her over. It's a story we can all understand. But watch this. The interpreters got a hold of it, and using that same subtle words, great meaning method, they did something incredible. They argued this poem wasn't about romance at all. No. The speaker, they said, was actually a virtuous queen. And the maiden she was looking for, that was a worthy woman the queen wanted to bring into the palace to be a concubine for her husband, the king. And she did it to keep the state stable, without any jealousy. Just like that, a passionate love song becomes a profound political lesson on selfless duty. All right, for our next text, the interpreters used a different strategy, but it was just as powerful. This time, instead of just rereading the words, they basically had to build the author's entire life story from scratch, just so the poem would fit into a very specific moral and historical narrative. The poem is called Encountering Misery, and it is the stunning but really strange piece of work. It's full of mythic journeys through the cosmos, spirit flights, gods. It's deeply personal, but it has almost zero clear historical context. It was so confusing that scholars basically decided the only way to make sense of it was that it had to be an allegory for the life of its author, a man named Kuei Yuan. The only problem was, they didn't really know much about him. So they built his life story. And that's the key here. It was built piece by piece over centuries, specifically to be a kind of decoder ring for his poetry. It started with just a vague story about a loyal guy who was wronged. Then, the great historian Sima Chen officially connected that story to the poem, and he wrote the first real biography that made the man's life match the poem's themes. Finally, later on, as even more poems got attached to this author, commentators just invented more specific life events to explain each and every one. The life was literally created to explain the art.
And this story they created, this tragic, loyal poet, it became so powerful and so popular that it actually jumped off the page and became embedded in the culture itself, creating traditions that are still alive today. So the legend that took hold ends in tragedy. Ku Yuan is this loyal minister, but he gets slandered by his rivals and is banished by his own king. When he hears that his kingdom's capital has been conquered, he just falls into total despair and drowns himself in a river. But this final, tragic act is what supposedly inspired the local people, who loved him, to spring into action.
And right out of this literary legend, you get the key traditions of the Dragon Boat Festival. Those frantic boat races, they're said to be a reenactment of the villagers racing out to try and save him. And the tradition of eating sticky rice dumplings, that supposedly comes from those same people dropping rice into the water to feed the fish, hoping to keep them from eating the poet's body. It's an amazing, direct line from literary interpretation to a huge cultural celebration.
So when you look at it all, the big takeaway is that the act of interpretation can be every bit as powerful as the act of creation. The meaning of these ancient texts wasn't something set in stone, locked away in the past. It was something alive, a powerful story that was constantly being reimagined by new generations to reflect their own values and to help shape their own future.